Good evening. My name is Mauricio Matisse, Communications Director at the Columbia Fiction Foundry. I'm pleased so many of you have joined us tonight. We are talking with author and publisher Jill Santopolo, Columbia College, class of 2003. Her first novel, The Light We Lost, released in 2017, was a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick. She recently released her fifth book, The Love We Found, a sequel to her debut. Jill's other books include Stars in an Italian Sky, Everything After, and More Than Words. Her books have been translated into more than 35 languages and have been named to several bestseller lists and have been optioned for film. Welcome, Jill. We're delighted to have you with the Columbia Fiction Foundry.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. It's really lovely to chat with you.
We're going to cover your journey from the Columbia College undergraduate to the release of your sterling debut, The Light We Lost, a book that has received many accolades. In fact, my copy has 6 pages of fabulous reviews, and one says it most plainly, an epic love story. We'll talk about your process and development as a writer, sharing insights for our audience of writers, focusing on your first and fifth book. And we'll end with a few questions from the audience. Perhaps you can start with a brief summary of The Light We Lost.
Absolutely. So The Light We Lost starts on September 11th, 2001 at Columbia University when two people, Gabe and Lucy, meet for the first time. And their relationship is kind of forged in the crucible of that day. And then the book follows them for the next 13 years as they come in and out of each other's lives, and experience a plethora of different events and emotions, and their own relationships to one another change.
Perhaps we can start by having you read the first, not the first page, but right at the beginning of your book. And we selected a small selection, and that way people get a sense of your writing style. And I put it up so that the audience can follow along as you read.
Sure. So this is not the skipping the prologue. So this is just the first chapter, and just a part of the first chapter. Sometimes objects seem like they've witnessed history. I used to imagine that the wooden table we sat around during Kramer's Shakespeare seminar our senior year was as old as Columbia. That it had been in that room since 1754, edges worn smooth by centuries of students like us, which of course couldn't be true. But that's how I pictured it. Students sitting there through the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, both world wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf. It's funny. If you asked me who else was with us that day, I don't think I could tell you. I used to be able to see all their faces so clearly, but 13 years later, I remember only you and Professor Kramer. I can't even recall the name of the TA who came running late into the classroom, later even than you. Kramer had just finished calling roll when you pushed open the door. You smiled at me, your dimple making a brief appearance as you slipped off your Diamondback's cap and stuck it in your back pocket. Your eyes landed quickly on the empty seat next to mine, and then you did, too. And you are? Kramer asked as you reached into your backpack for a notebook and a pen. Gabe, you said. Gabriel Sampson. Kramer checked the paper in front of him. Let's aim for on time for the rest of the semester, Mr. Sampson, he said. Class starts at 9. In fact, let's aim for early. You nodded, and Kramer started talking about themes in Julius Caesar. We at the height are ready to decline, he read. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Amid all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea we are now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. I trust you all did the reading. Who can tell me what Brutus is saying about fate and free will here?
Thank you, Jill. Because we're among Columbia alumni, I should note that your book starts in Professor Kramer's class in Philosophy Hall. The class eventually gets interrupted by a TA announcing a plane has struck one of the Twin Towers. Lucy and Gabe soon go to Ween Hall rooftop to watch the smoldering downtown of 9/11. There are Columbia references throughout the book. Tell us about the overlap with your campus experience and Lucy's and Gabe's fictional account.
Sure. So if Lucy and Gabe were real, they would have graduated with me. I graduated at the end of in June of 2002. And I also was in a Shakespeare class on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Professor Castan, David Castan, I don't know how many of you knew him or took a class with him. But it wasn't a seminar, it was a lecture that he was teaching then. And after class was interrupted by a TA who came running in to tell us that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And then we walked out after class was over, and it sort of felt like we had been in there learning Shakespeare and the entire world had changed. And I did, like Lucy and Gabe, go to the roof of Ween, or try to go to the roof of Ween. I looked out the window and then I sort of was not as brave as they were and just went back down the elevator. Um, but a lot of what I experienced and what my friends at school experienced that day sort of got put into this book in various different ways. So
Thank
I
you.
don't think it would have been written if I hadn't gone to Columbia when I did.
Yeah, and for all of us New Yorkers, if you read your book, New York plays quite a significant role. In fact, I think the dedication of the book is to New York City. Talk about the role of place in your book, specifically for Lucy.
Um, yeah, Lucy stays in New York her whole life, essentially. And it's a really grounding place for her. And it's a place where she sees her life kind of opening up and all of the opportunities she's looking for are there. But Gabe, on the other hand, leaves. And I think when he comes back a number of times to New York City, he sort of looks at what has changed and looks at what has remained the same and sort of uses the city as the marker of time passing in his life and what it would have looked like had he not left.
Yeah, the at one point in the book, pretty early on, Lucy thinks to herself about Gabe and says, "You would never be happy in New York." Of course, she's saying that to herself. I guess the point here is people are New Yorkers or they're not. Is that the way you pictured your characters, and that's how you ended up Gabe leaving New York?
Yeah, I mean, Lucy was definitely a New Yorker through and through. And I think Gabe, I think Gabe needed to go somewhere, but I think in the end could have come back. I think he needed to experience some other things, but there was a pull for him to New York and to Lucy that he sort of just kept circling back and kept using it as his measuring stick of, where he was and what he'd done and how his life looked in comparison to what was happening in New York.
Let's switch a little bit to talk about the craft of your writing. We recently just, and I use that term because we just had a workshop that talked about point of view. I think readers of The Light We Lost immediately encounters an unusual point of view. It's first person, second person addressed. The you is not the reader, but Gabe, like a long letter to him. Hello there.
Sorry,
uh,
this is my daughter who at night likes to be around me. She was just drawing, but she's back. So she may pop her head in, but we can keep talking.
and she's in New York.
She's in New York. She's a little New
uh,
Yorker.
So how did that come about, that point of view? Why did you choose that point of view? Were there specific books that you drew inspiration from? It is something that as a reader at the beginning, you're not sure why it's in that form. Can you talk a little bit about that decision as a writer that you made?
Okay, I'm sorry, sweet girl. Um, yes, I can, and apologies again. So one of the books that I had read before I wrote this was The Virgin Suicides, which is not told in this perspective at all, but is told, I believe it's in the first person plural. It's about the narration is we. And I thought that that was really super interesting to have a sort of alternate, unexpected narration style and to figure out what you would need to do as a writer to make it work. And part of the reason I chose this specific one was I started writing this book after a horrible breakup in my early 30s. And I kept walking around thinking like my inner monologue has somehow become a conversation with this person who I loved and is no longer here. And all day long, I would walk around and think, oh, there are flowers on the taxi cabs right now. I don't know why there are flowers on the taxi cabs. I wonder, I bet if I went home, this guy would have read the news and know why there are taxi cabs. Why there are flowers in the taxi cabs. Or I'd walk by a new restaurant and I would think, oh, I should tell him that this new restaurant is here. But of course I couldn't because we were no longer together. And I wanted to try and capture in this narration the intimacy of feeling like there is someone else who you're so close to who is in your internal monologue. Um, and then, so I started writing it that way for that reason. And I'm part of this writers group who I've been part of this group for very, very long time at this point. I don't even know how long, more than a decade, maybe more than 2 decades. Um, and one of my friends in that group, her name is Marie Rutkowski. She's a brilliant writer. She said to me, I think this is really cool, and your explanation for why you did this is really cool. But unless you can figure out a plot that earns you this narrative style, it's not going to work. So, what is the plot that earns this style? And I was
Interesting.
like, um, and she said, well, what happens at the end? And I started pitching endings to her essentially until I hit one where she was like, that earns it. Do that, and then you can write this way. And I think she was totally right because it does give that feeling of intimacy, but also it needs to make sense plot wise. Um, so it did. And then when I was working on the sequel, which I know we're going to talk about a bit later, I knew I had to keep that narrative style. So my first challenge with the sequel is what is going to be the plot that earns that narrative style as well.
Was it a challenge for you to keep that point of view during the writing, or did you even experiment with other points of view when you were working on the novel, or did you just went with this one from the beginning?
This one just felt natural from the beginning, and once I got into it, it was really easy to keep going with it. Because
Okay.
it's almost storytelling, you know? It's like you're telling the story to someone. I'm telling this, or Lucy is telling her story. I'm telling Lucy's story through Lucy to someone else. And once you have sort of created that audience for the story, it's easy to figure out what to include and what not to include, what you would want to tell that person and what you wouldn't. So it sort of made some decisions for me having that narrative style.
And my next question was a little bit about that ending, and when you get to the book and you read the book, and you get to the end, that point of view makes sense, of course.
With
And
thanks to Marie.
and the question that I had was, and you kind of already started answering, it was, did you map out that ending beforehand, or did you just arrive at it serendipitously as you were thinking about or working on the book. The book is around 300 pages or so, a little under 300 if I remember. So did you have other endings, or this was really the one ending that made the whole point of view work?
So I had I had come up with other ideas for endings, and that conversation happened probably when I was like 50 pages into the book, maybe 100 pages in. So from that point on, I knew what I was writing toward. But I didn't know at what point I was going to stop the story. So I actually wrote the ending a bunch of times where I had stopped it earlier, I stopped it later, and I kind of was trying to figure out the exact point at which I felt good about finishing the story. And, sometimes it just felt like it was going on too long, and sometimes it felt like there wasn't enough of a sort of resolution. And then I had sent a draft to my editor and I said, I'm still not sure about this ending. I don't know if I hit it in the right spot. And she had said to me, can you add a letter? Can you put a letter at the end? And I think that will tie it all up. And that's what I did. And she was right. And it felt at that point like I had really finished this book.
Right. Yeah. Um, me switch a little bit to a different aspect of the book that I also found very interesting. Throughout the book, you sprinkle literary references, starting with
Mhm.
Shakespeare in the passage that you read. You have poems, novels, children's books, etc. As a reader, I really enjoy encountering these. Uh, Sometimes, especially when they're not credited or anything like that. You even mentioned Lit Hum and Contemporary Civilization, the courses
Mhm.
from Columbia's famed core curriculum. Give us your thoughts about using these.
Sorry, Laura. You
Give
can
it,
stay here, but I just need you to be quiet, okay?
give,
Um,
give us some thoughts about using references like this in your writing. Is it common? You have four other books than besides the
yeah.
one we're talking about. Is that something you enjoy putting in your books? And again, the connection back to Columbia.
So, Lucy as a character makes these references a lot in this book and a bit in the sequel, though less so. And I started her and I developed her character this way because of Lit Hum and Cece. And I had this professor for Lit Hum who was actually on the English faculty, Michael Seidel, who I thought was just so smart and so wonderful. And he called the Columbia Core curriculum the dinner party curriculum because he said you could have conversations at a dinner party about pretty much anything under the sun after you go to Columbia. Um, and I thought, like, with, you know, Lucy graduating right out of Columbia, she has all of that in her head. So as she's sort of telling the story, the pieces that relate to what she's going through would be sort of what was in her inner monologue. And also, Gabe, knowing that she has the same reference points that he does, would make those references too. Um, so, in the books that star Lucy, there are a lot of these sorts of references. In Everything After, which is a different character, there's a lot of music references there because she's a musician. So, because she's a musician, I figured, all right, like the way she sees the world would involve making musical connections. Um, so that's what's sort of in her story. Um, and I'm trying to think in Stars in Italian Sky, there's a bit of referencing visual art, not quite as much, but one of the characters there is a visual artist, so that comes up a bit. So I do sort of like finding the way my characters would look at the world, and then making sure those references are there to sort of flesh out the narration in a way that makes it feel like only that character could have written this book. or could be the narrator for this book. I wrote the book.
I should point out to our audience that some of at least my copy has a little table at the back of some of the references that you make for the literary references, but it also includes a bunch of soundtrack for the book. So you mentioned music, so that also has I would say maybe 15 songs that are listed that you suggest should be listened to while people read the book.
Yeah, I used to, I don't as much anymore, but I used to run a lot in Central Park. And when I was running was sort of when I would think about the story and what, was going to happen in each book. And I had like a running soundtrack for each book that sort of to me evoked the feelings of the book and sort of what I wanted to happen emotionally. So those were the songs that I was listening to when I was running and thinking about the book. So I transferred them into Spotify playlists for if you have a book club and you need a soundtrack for your book club.
They're up on Spotify. That's great.
Yeah.
We should put a link out to our members so they have it when we put up the YouTube video. Let's switch again to a slightly different topic. The Light We Lost takes place over 13 years, which is more or less the same time from your graduation date to the release of the book in 2017. Looking back, what lessons would you share with emerging writers that are working on their first book? Anything that I'm sure during that time there was a lot of work with agents, editors, etc. And any lessons that you can share?
I would say my biggest pieces of advice are find writer friends you trust and have a writing group because I feel like so much of my writing, my early writing in particular, was critiqued by other writers I really trusted, and I learned a lot from them, both from their critiques, but also from my critiques of their work and reading their work. Um, so I think that was a huge help to me. And also, I would suggest reading your work out loud. That I found really helpful too, sort of listening to the rhythm of it and getting to points where like I found myself kind of bored reading out loud. So I was like, all right, if I'm bored reading this out loud, then someone else is going to be bored reading it, even in their head. So let me look at this section and, mark that up. Or even like I heard myself repeating certain words and I was like, all right, I've used this word too many times, or I used this metaphor twice and I've got to, axe one of those. So I found that, I was visually, I gone through this draft, 17 times. I mean, how many times? A million times. Um, so reading it out loud just sort of changed the way I heard it and the way I saw it. So I think those would be my two like writing craft tips.
The group that you joined, is that, as far as you know, similar to the kinds of groups that we put together at the CFF? I know that you recently joined the CFF as well. And I don't know how much you know about the work we do, but was it a organized group, or was it just friends that you got together and formed a group?
We were friends who got together and formed a group, and some people left and other people joined. The iteration it's in right now has been the iteration for a long time. Um, and we we don't have any formal meeting schedule. We don't have any, pages that are due at any point. We just sort of say, at any point at all, if you're working on a book and you need help, you kind of just raise up the flag and you're like, hey, can we get a meeting on the calendar? I have 50 pages and I don't know what to do next. Who's available to read? And typically everybody says, I'm available to read. Let's meet in 3 weeks. Um, and we eat and drink and talk about our books and
Do you
um
share whole chapters or you wait till the book is pretty much ready? What is
At
your
any point, like the group is really flexible and is happy to help at any point. So I typically will share the first chunk of a book and sort of make sure that I'm on track and that the characters are feeling good, the voice is feeling good, and then I sort of talk through where I think the book is going to go. And then I send it again at the end and say, all right, I finished a whole book. Here we go. What do you think of this? Before I send it anywhere else.
right? All right. So we're going to move over to talk a little bit about your most recent release. I just want to remind everybody in the attendance that to continue using the Q&A option if you want to have any questions for Jill. We'll try to get to some of those at the end of our conversation. Um, on your latest release, The Love We Found, was recently released. It's a sequel. Can you go over when it was released, a little summary? I think we also need to point out that spoilers are going to happen. So there's no other way to talk about the sequel without giving some spoilers about the first book. So once again, if you can give us a brief overview and then take a couple of minutes to read a couple of paragraphs from The Love We Found.
Sure. So if anyone does not want to spoil The Light We Lost, just cover your ears now.
Mhm.
Um, but so in The Light we find Lucy again, and it is 10 years after Gabriel has died, and she is living in Brooklyn and trying to figure herself out, trying to get over him, trying to figure out how she is going to exist in the world and whether there's space for love in her life at this point. And she is asked by Gabe's former editor to go through some of his old photographs to find a few of them that they want to put in a retrospective of his work that he's done. And when she does, she finds an address in Rome and decides that she has to follow it. She has to know why he kept this address in his things. And what she finds there sort of sends her on this journey of kind of learning and healing and finally figuring out a way to move forward. And it came out this past March, which was about 8 years after The Light Be Lost.
Great. And so I'm going to bring up the section that you're going to read for us, and
Sure.
I'll get out of the way here.
Sometimes I wake up and for a brief moment, you are alive, Gabe. In that blurry place between dreams and reality, you're smiling. Your arms are wrapped around me. You're saying, I love you, Lucy. I will love you until the day I die and then some. Just like you whispered to me when we went hiking in Cold Spring 2 decades ago. We climbed to the top of the Bull Hill Trail and were taking in the most breathtaking view of the Hudson River. Your whispered words, the reverence with which you said them, made me shiver, made me lean back, turn my head, and kiss you hard and deep, like I needed to show you that I'd love you till the day I died and then some too. I forgot about those words for years, but they've come back to me recently. Come back to me in those liminal moments when I'm not quite asleep, but not quite awake. And then the sun brightens or the alarm goes off and it hits me. You're gone. I wonder, particularly on those days, about the and then some. Is there a piece of you somewhere that loves me still? Or is it all in the past? Are we ancient history, and am I the archivist keeping it alive?
Maybe the first question around your sequel is if you can talk a little bit about why you decided to write a sequel.
Sure. So I had not intended initially to write a sequel to The Light We Lost. I thought this is a standalone book. I stopped it where I wanted to stop it, and that was the story. I realized early on that some people might not agree with me that that was the story and that's where it ended. Because pretty soon after I'd finished it, I'd sold the book, I did revisions, all of that, and I sent the final manuscript to one of my sisters. And I said, "Hey, this is what I'm working on. I just sold it, and if you want to read it, here are the pages. And so she read it, and then I went over to her apartment to babysit my niece. And then when my sister came back from wherever she had been that night, she said to me, "Oh, hey, before you go, I really liked the book you sent, and would you just mind telling me what happens next?" And I said, "Allie, nothing happens next. The book is done." And she's like, "No, no, 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 that's not true." I said, "No, it really is. Like, that's all I wrote. That's the end." And she said, "Well, I kind of call BS on that because if you made up the book, you can just make up what happens next. So before you go, can you just sit down and make up what happens next? Because I really need to know." So I made up a little something something for her. But that was sort of the first request for a sequel. And then over the years, once the book came out, I got DMs and emails and comments about people about a sequel and what happened next. And I would get these messages that will say, "Well, just could you please tell me, like, how is Lucy's marriage? Or could you please just tell me, like, how are her kids? Or could you just please tell me?" And there would always be, something like that. So I started talking to my editor about the idea of a sequel, and we talked about it for a while I wrote some other books. And then she finally said, "Okay, I think it's time. It's time for you to write the sequel." So I went back over all of those emails and all of those DMs and tried to answer every question that anyone had asked me, and put the answer in the sequel, which at the beginning meant that the book sort of felt a bit like a book report on Lucy's life. So I had to fix that up. But I really wanted to make sure that if I was doing it, I was going to get in everything that people wanted to hear.
Yeah,
Hopefully, I did an okay job.
certainly there were a lot of loose ends that needed to be, people who connected with your characters would probably want to know. So, um, in one review of the book, I saw a mention of the novel's evocative settings, including Italy's Lampedusa, an island that's south of Sicily. Can you
Mhm.
talk about Italy and why this island caught your attention, and perhaps touch on the library there with the silent books? I think
Mhm.
it's something that connects with your other job, which is a children's book publisher.
Yeah, so I knew I wanted Lucy to leave New York in part of this book, and I knew that it was only when she left that she could sort of break out of the sort of routine that she'd been in and be open to more. And I wanted it to be a place where Gabe could have gone or would have gone in the year or so before he died that she wouldn't have known about. Um, so I was looking because in the book world, in the world of the book, he died in 2014. So I was trying to think about what would he have covered as a war correspondent or a journalist, a photojournalist during that year. And I came up with the Syrian refugee crisis, which I think he absolutely would have covered and was something that was very important, um, specifically at that time. So I started reading about the different places where a lot of the Syrian refugees went. And one of them was this island of Lampedusa. And my family and my husband's family both have half Italian lineage and have tons of cousins in Italy, and particularly my husband's family. He has tons of cousins there. And we've gone to visit them a number of times. And I thought, you know what? If I choose Lampedusa, then next time we're in Italy visiting family, we can actually go on a really cool research trip, which we did. And it was an incredible, incredible island with so much history and um, really unique place. And one of the things that was really special about it is they have this children's library, and they have the largest collection of what we would call wordless picture books, but they call silent books, which are picture books where it's just story, just art, just art through story, story through art. Did that backwards, story through art. Um, and you don't have to speak the same language or speak any specific language to read the book and to get something out of it. So because Lampedusa is still a hotspot of refugees sort of coming through to go to Europe, to go to mainland Europe, they still have this library where anyone speaking any language can come and enjoy a picture book.
Right. Um, so maybe one last question before we turn to some of the audience questions, and we have quite a few of them that we will probably be able to get to. Um, we heard you read two of the short passages, and you had told me that you read the audio versions of your books.
Mhm.
Uh, Tell us a little bit about that experience, the production. What's it like revisiting your book in such detail? You actually mentioned earlier that you should read out loud. So here you are, now you're reading out loud, although you can't change it anymore. Um, what was that like? If you can share with us that experience of going into a studio and reading your book from beginning to end.
Sure. So I had done a bit of theatrical acting when I was at Columbia and a little bit afterward. But I hadn't intended to read the audio versions of my books until my agent said to me, "Hey, I think you should audition. I've heard you read your work before, and I think you do a really nice job, and I think you should audition." So I said, I don't know if this is a job I should have, but I'm happy to audition and find out what they think. So I did, and the audiobook people said, we liked your audition. We liked the way you read it. And if you want to read your audiobook, we'll give you the job. So I said, okay, um, not really knowing what was in store. And what the experience was like was going into this recording studio, and there's a little recording booth. It's totally soundproof. And my book was on an iPad, so that you don't actually turn the pages, so that they don't hear the pages turn. And there was water and tea and a lot of snacks because the microphone is so sensitive, it can also pick up any noise your stomach makes at all. So you have to eat a lot of snacks. And then outside of the booth, there was a director and a sound engineer. But I could only hear what they said if they pressed a button. Otherwise, I was just in this like silent booth with my book and my voice and me. So it took us, I think, 4 days of recording.
Wow.
We had a bunch of breaks, so it wasn't like 4 days straight, but we would break for rests every, hour or so. Um, and I would start reading and the director would press his button and would say, "You popped that P, please, say that word again," or "That's actually not how you pronounce that word, Jill. Let's say it this way," or, things like that. Um, and then when we got to the end of The Light We Lost, I started reading and he wasn't stopping me. So I kept going and I kept going. And I found myself starting to tear up at the end of the book. And I was so horrified. And I was like, is crying at your own book like laughing at your own joke? Like this is horrifically embarrassing. So I'm doing my very, very best not to cry. Though if you listen to the audiobook, I think anyone who is listening for it can hear my voice start to wobble. And the director's still not stopping me, and I'm still going, and I'm still going. And the book ends, and now I actually am crying. And I look up and I can see them, even though I can't hear them. And the audiobook director, he has tears streaming down his face. And I look over and at the sound engineer, and she has a pile of tissues next to the soundboard. And then they see me looking at them, and the director pushes the button and he goes, I think we need a little break now. And it was really incredible though, because usually as a writer, you don't see people reacting to your book.
Right.
They're reading it wherever they're reading it, and you've done your part and you're, working on something else at that point. But in this moment, in real time, I saw two people reacting to the story I wrote and to the words I put out there. And it was so incredible and so kind of mind-blowing. And I imagine it's like what a screenwriter must feel like if they're sitting in an audience at a movie theater and people start, getting emotional about their book. So that was sort of what my audiobook experience was like. So after that, when they asked me if I wanted to read the next ones, I said yes. The only one I did not read was Stars in an Italian Sky because the audiobook producer said to me, "How good is your Italian accent?" And I said, "Not good enough to read the book." Um, so they hired a wonderful, wonderful audiobook narrator who read that one, who has a beautiful Italian accent.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. That was great. We can imagine you in that booth there watching everybody crying over your book. So let's turn to a few questions. We have a number of them. I'm going to start with one that touches on some of the things we talked about, and it's from Christy Oglesby, and she writes, in terms of making your work accessible to any reader, how do you balance infusing being a New Yorker and making the city integral to the book, and making literary references for people who are not lit majors? How much explaining do you do, or you leave it to the reader to find their way?
So that's a great question. What I try to do is make it so that from context, any reader can get the important pieces of what I'm saying. So, like, there's a bar that Lucy and Gabe go to called Faces and Names, which is a real bar that I used to go to all the time. I loved it. And it had a couch with a fireplace, which I always thought was really special. My friends and I did. I don't know. Um, but if you don't live in New York and you don't know that there is a real Faces and Names, it doesn't actually stop you from understanding the purpose of Faces and Names, which is just the bar that these kids in their 20s go to a lot and, enjoy. So I try to do that where, like, if you are someone living in New York, or particularly someone who lived in New York during the time in which the book is set, you'll get extra from it, but it won't hold anyone back from understanding the story, if that makes
Right.
sense.
Great. Thank you, Jill. So we have a question from Kara who writes, would you please talk about the process of getting published? And it overlaps. There are a couple of folks who asked a very similar question, so I'm going to kind of put two of them together. How long did it take you to get a publisher? What did that entail? Any other advice for unpublished fiction writers? How do you find a literary agent? How do you pitch your work to the publisher? And again, I'm taking a couple of questions and putting
Mhm.
them to one if you have some comments on those.
Sure. So the way that I found my agent is not the way most people find their agent because I also work in the industry. So when I'm not writing novels for grown-ups, I edit picture books for kids and some slightly older books for kids. So my agent, whose name is Miriam Altschuler, and we've been together for more than a decade, um, she and I met because we were both working on a project, on a children's book project together. And we had lunch and we really got along. And she basically said to me, like, "Hey, I know you write stuff. Who's your agent?" And I said, "I actually don't have one now." Because I had had an agent and I wrote a couple of children's chapter books with that agent. And then what I wanted to write was not really what she wanted to represent. What she wanted to represent was not really what I wanted to write. So at that point during that lunch, I was agentless, and Miriam had said to me, "Well, why don't you send me your work and I'll see if I like it, and if I like it, I'll represent you, and if I don't, we'll just keep on keeping on." Um, and I ended up sending her, I think, the beginning of The Light We Lost, and she was interested. Um, as far as pitch as and then she was the one who ended up pitching it to publishers because, she was my agent. So, as far as advice on finding an agent, what I typically tell people is, and maybe you've heard this a million times already, but is to read the acknowledgments of the books that you think have the same audience as your book. And then those are the agents to reach out to because they're interested in that space. And you can also say something about other books that they've worked on, which is always, I think, a welcome connection with an agent.
And if I can add another connection, Miriam was part of a Columbia Fiction Foundry event a couple of years ago. Her recording is still on our YouTube site if anybody wants to look at that. And she came to us with some of her colleagues from her agency, and so that's someone that we know as well. So thank you for bringing that up. So again, I'm going to group a couple of questions that came in. One of them says, congratulations, you're very productive. Can you share, and this is from Stacy Bolton, can you share your writing routine? And related to that is the question that may be related to the routine and is, what made you write in that first person versus third person? Maybe you can tie those two together, although they're a little bit apart.
Sure. So my writing routine, I essentially, so when I went to grad school, I went to grad school for an MFA in Vermont. And we had to write a certain number of words per month. And then you would send in those words and they would get critiqued and you would have to write the same number of words again the next month. So my friends and I there, we used to go on what we called the bet, where you would say to someone, I bet I can write 1,000 words this week, whatever it is. And then you had to check in with them and let them know at the end of the week whether you hit your word count. And if you didn't hit your word count, the punishment was you had to donate $20 to a pre-chosen cause that you did not agree with, like did not believe in at all. I chose something that is so anathema to who I am that like there is no chance I would ever want to give money to this cause. So, and that sort of just trained me to say like, okay, this is my word count. I've got to hit it this week. This is my word count. I've got to hit it this week. And there were a whole bunch of other rules about it, like you could pre-write, but you couldn't post-write. So if you knew that you were going to be really busy the next week, you could write some words in advance the week before, but you couldn't write them afterward. There were just a lot of rules that we made for this process. And I still sort of do that, where I'll say to myself, okay, I'm going to break this book down. I need to write 75,000 words by the end of the year. I need to write this many words a week. And um, I don't usually punish myself at this point if I don't, but sometimes I'll say to myself, like, all right, you've really got to do this. And if you don't, you've got to donate that $20 because you got to get back on this, story. So, that's sort of how I get stuff done, um, by really breaking it down into word count, but then also, you know, knowing that I might have to punish myself if I don't do my work properly.
Okay.
Oh,
Uh,
and then the point of view, sorry, point of view
yeah.
was the other half of that question. Um, so some of my books are not in first person, some of them are in third. But this one, because what I was really trying to capture intimacy, and I felt like the only way to be really intimate in a book is to be in first person and to really be in that person's body and in their mind. Um, because otherwise, you're creating a narrative distance from the get-go, which for some of my books I wanted. And for some of my books, I think really, was the right choice for that book. But for this book, for what I wanted to create, it had to be really intimate. So it had to be first person.
Right. So maybe we'll take one last question from the audience, from Melissa Osen. She writes, when in writers group or getting feedback from people, how do you decide to take criticism versus going with what you think is best? I have concerns about taking criticism from groups where everyone might be influenced by one another. And I think this is common in any group where you're critiquing. You begin to hear the same kind of comments repeating. um, so any comments on that question? That was from Melissa Olsen.
Yeah, so two comments on that one. So the first one is I only take feedback that resonates with me. So if someone says something and and I get that sort of feeling of like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense and I understand that, I will take that feedback. The other thing is sometimes I find that the feedback is not about what it's about, but is about a question in the manuscript that's not being answered properly and somewhere else. So sometimes I'll look at something and, three people will have similar feedback about, but it's all opposite. Like someone will say, this scene is going too quickly, and the other person will say, this scene is going too slowly, and another person will say, like, I don't think this scene is deep enough, and, I can't take all of those pieces of criticism and incorporate them together because they're contradictory. But I know there's something wrong with that scene. And I don't know if it's that I haven't set it up properly earlier with what the characters need to know or what they need to do or how they need to act, or if there's something that is missing from the way I've put the scene together. But I know from the criticism that something is wrong there. And that's what then I have to go back and look at. But I don't necessarily have to listen to the person who says it went too fast or it went too slow. So my two things are if something resonates, I go with it. And if there are a lot of things, even if they're at cross purposes, I need to like it. I've got to be a super sleuth and figure out what is going on. Like what kind of literary detection can I do here to fix it?
All right, we have about a minute or so. Maybe we can squeeze in one last one from Anne that talks about your genres, women's fiction, contemporary romance. Do you agree on genre, or does your editor and publisher, I guess the question is, are they the ones who pick the genre? Um, and what about these genres, chick lit and book club lit, which was discussed at the Agents Roundtable, which is an event we had here. If you can do a quick 30 seconds on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, my publisher and editor do choose it. I it wasn't part of a conversation that I had, and essentially, I did ask about it afterward, and they said, these genres are ways to find your audience. And we think the audience for your book is going to be in the women's fiction genre. And if we can get those people to find your book by labeling it women's fiction, then that's what we're going to label it so that those readers can find it. And that made a lot of sense to me.
Right.
And I think that it's probably like that with any type of genre. Um, my book probably could have been in a few different places, but if this was where the strongest, if this is where the strongest audience was for it, then this is where I wanted it to live, where I want it to live so that the people who will enjoy it will find it.
Great. Um, I'm going to answer one last question that came in. That workshop on point of view, we did not record because it was a very small event. So unfortunately, we don't have a recording for that. That was a question from Anne. I want to thank our viewers who asked some great questions. In fact, some people like your betting.
Going on
You're
the bet.
forcing yourself, yeah, you're forcing yourself to write. I saw somebody mention that Oh, that's a great idea. But we have reached the end of the hour, and I want to thank you, Jill, for your insights, and of course to all the CFF members who joined us today. For those who can't wait to get their hands on Jill's books, we have links where you can purchase them on the registration page for this event. The CFF also has two more events this fall. We have on November 11th, Jesse Glenn will present on the role of book publicity. The registration for that is open. On December 2nd, we will have Dawn Raffel, writer, editor, and creative writing teacher. Registration for that will open in early November. Again, I thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you there. I think we'll now close the Zoom room.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your questions, everyone.